I am Katie Lukas, and I am the Director of Digital Strategy and Technology with Cronin. And I'm really excited to do this. We thought that personas would be boring and nobody would show up, so we're really excited that personas are not boring, and people did show up. And the idea here, Tim and Lego have so much data, and they have so much going on with user experience. And on the agency side, sometimes you have to do scrappy UX. You know, you can't necessarily depend on everything being right and ready and having clients who are receptive and ready to listen and invested. So, you know, the Lego group has defined its category. They have a very privileged position. There's lots of things, I'm sure, that are messy at Lego. But, you know, the demand is there and the differentiation is there. So their personas get to play a different role. You know, they sort of get to be the stars of that show. But on the agency side, that's not necessarily true. You know, we have to think about a lot of different questions when we meet a project and when we meet a client. You know, how do you build a digital or physical product that stands out and not in a gimmicky way? How do you create moments of truth, even though that sounds like a gimmick? You know, this is really about that. You know, personas give you an avenue into what's called 0 moments of truth. You know, finding those moments when you can deeply affect a person. How do these exercises scale up and down? This is a big one from an agency perspective. I mean, you might have a little tiny project. It still needs UX. It still needs personas. You still need to understand the customer. How can you do that on a shoestring? And then how can you blow that up? You know, how do you do it for a $50,000 project? How do you do it for a $5 million project? And how does that work? You know, how does that actually translate? And then where do they fit into the sales process? This is tough for a lot of agencies, not always, but developing a part of the pitch that works and is convincing and elucidating when you're meeting with a client that doesn't necessarily understand the persona process or what role they have. And personas are a way to find those moments of truth and design into them. Okay? We see personas functioning in 3 critical areas. Okay? Design. These are the design areas are where most people think of personas. You know, you're doing wireframes, you're doing information architecture, you're creating templates and beautiful websites and apps and products and teapots. I personally think their communication function is maybe at least as important as the design function. You can use them as a tool to communicate. You can create personas that are strong enough to be a through line through all of your conversations with your clients. You can also use them internally in terms of different silos in your organization. You know, making sure that you're actually communicating the customer and the user and their needs throughout your organization. And narrative is also important. This is where I really see agencies being able to build in the marketing component into personas, because your persona becomes a character in the narrative of your product or your service, or your client's product or their service. So you can start to contextualize marketing and promotion and advertising in ways that are really hard if you're thinking about something as an abstract segment or an abstract target. And here's a big one. All 3 are related to empathy for the users. Personas are naturally an empathic exercise. It's an exercise in empathizing with your user. This softness is what makes selling them a little tricky. And if you have very fluffy personas, that can be even harder. So it becomes an onus on the designer, on the UX practitioner, and on the salesperson to be able to convey the data-driven nature, the quantifiable nature, as well as the qualifiable nature of the personas. So, which leads us into stakeholder buy-in. Okay? It can often be a challenge, internally and externally, to produce something that feels fluffy or soft, like a persona. The first thing is that They won't work if you don't have absolute faith in them. We also hear a lot of stories about people drafting a persona and then they get filed away and nobody pays attention to them anymore. That happens a lot. Or they get turned into user stories and people pay attention to the user stories because they're an agile shop, and then they forget about the personas that actually drove the user stories. So you have to be willing to advocate for the personas. If you're not going to do that, it's almost not worth it. It's also important to be very clear about the type of personas you're choosing. I talk a little bit more about this later on in terms of what kinds of personas you might be looking for or looking at. But that will help you be clear about the goals that you have for your personas. And don't overpromise on ROI. It's really easy to say we're going to make personas and then sales are going to increase by 20%. If you can't draw a clear and direct line from personas to sales increases, don't promise it. Talk about customer experience. Talk about the fact that, your business can't survive without customers or users, and they're a critical element of what you're doing. But if you're trying to pull data where no data exists, it's not going to work. If the data does exist, then that's great. Lego has that. You get to do some of that. If you do have a wealth of analytics that you can draw straight lines back to your personas, by all means do, but that tends to be the exception rather than the rule. Stages of personas: research, getting to know and empathize your users, and I go through each of these sections in a moment. Development, and the reason, just to back up 1 second, the reason I'm going through all this, you probably know a lot about this. But where I want to talk about is scaling up or down on these components. It's easy to sort of read a book and say, okay, we're going to do from step A to step Z, and build a persona, and we have to go through all these things, and we have all of these checklists. It can be sort of a little bit more freewheeling and a little bit more scalable than that. Development, building the personas. Refinement, testing and improving the personas, and I'm going to highlight that one because that's also where you get to do your presentation of your personas, and your socializing the personas and the publicizing of the personas. Extrapolation, where we can turn to some other mechanisms and methodologies and frameworks like building functional requirements, end state scenarios, and jobs to be done out of the persona. Extending the persona into things like journey maps, touchpoint maps, market maps. Using the persona as the design foundation. Again, I think that tends to be the most familiar one for UX practitioners. And then measurement. How do you use the persona to measure success? Little quote from Alan Cooper, who is usually acknowledged as the creator of personas. There's a little bit of maybe not. But design is not something that comes from your head. Design is something that solves a real problem in the real world. Okay, and that's something that's really easy to forget as a designer. It's easy to design for yourself, self-referential design. It's easy to imagine yourself in the user's shoes. Where research comes in is showing you that that is not the case. Data analysis and stakeholder interviews are kind of the basic steps that you need to take. If you're on a shoestring and you still want to produce personas, you can do it. You got to look at what you have around you. Stakeholder interviews are usually doable. Data analysis is pretty much always doable. Look at your Google Analytics. Look at your Adobe customer experience if you've got it. Market research reports. And that can be baseline research for provisional or proto or ad hoc personas, which are still better than nothing. User interviews and surveys and polls. You get to scale up a little bit more, and you want to get out there and talk to real people and do real surveys and polls. Phone interviews are great. In-person interviews are always better. If you have a lab with a two-way mirror, that's terrific. A lot of us don't have that. But anytime you can get out there in the field and see what people are really doing in their real lives, you're going to be better off than not. And then finally, if you can really scale it up, you get out there and you do ethnographic research. You're in the shops or you're on the street. You're talking to real people with tablets and iPads and paper and index cards. You can do user and client customer workshops, okay, where you're building an agenda and you're really driving to a data-driven goal, okay? Persona development. this is where some people get into trouble. If you're new to personas, or even if you're not new to personas, you don't do it that often, you frequently go and download a template and use that. And I've done it many times. The problem is that if the persona is not customized to what your project is and what your client is, they'll frequently fail you because they're giving you the wrong data, or they're too fluffy and somebody really wanted to talk about their dogs and it gets into the persona and then the executive looks at it and says, I don't care about puppies. It's, that kind of thing. If you're not really thinking about the data that you need out of the persona, then you're not going to use personas most effectively, and you're not going to be able to present them most effectively. Okay. So what type of persona? User, buyer, marketing persona. Depending on the organization, you may or may not differentiate between these. But a user persona is typically a user interface persona, somebody who's using a website or a piece of software or an app. A buyer persona is frequently used in B2B organizations because your buyer is not necessarily your user. So it's a different sort of equation. And then a marketing persona frequently will involve a lot more demographic information than a user persona needs. So those tend to skew more towards income and demographics and zip codes, stuff like that. Make the persona your own. Don't ever be afraid to customize the persona and make it as big or as short or as little as you need. And then what's important? Use that process to really hone in on the data that you actually need to use to make decisions. This is an example that I'm showing you because it's a highly customized persona. I did a project where I built a private persona, a proto-persona based on what I knew about the client, and I never showed anybody. The reason I did it was because I wanted to see what kind of information we needed about the persona. So then I used that to develop the sample and to develop the template that we actually went to the client with. And there is some fluffy stuff. The reason there's a little bit of fluff in here is because it's a sales organization that was going to be using these personas. So they actively needed to know things like hobbies. These were salespeople who were talking to customers, and that was vital information for them. Same with single and income. These were all selected to be specific data points that affected the customer's decision about the product. Persona development, and again, we're starting at these top two. These are provisional internal personas. Provisional meaning they're not based on real user information. They're based on data that you do, research that you do, things that you know in your head or that other stakeholders know, your client stakeholders know. And you create ad hoc personas, which is what those are, provisional, ad hoc, proto. Persona development using workshops and synthesis. Workshops are great if you can get a team of people together. You can work with your client, you can work with your customer, and you can all get together in a room and tack all of this stuff up and really start to validate in the moment. And the synthesis is what drives those workshops. I should have put synthesis first. Data-driven persona development and persona presentation. The data-driven persona development takes all of that other stuff that's stacked up on top of it and turns it into a persona that you feel captures a real customer, a real individual, a real personality, somebody that you could meet on the street. And present the personas internally, also very important. So this is where we get into refinement. Part of the refinement process is part of the socialization process, because that's where you get to bring in people that haven't been involved in creating the personas. And that, speaking of moments of truth, that's a tough one. You know, the moment that you drag your personas out and you show them to the world and you've given birth and here they are, and then you invariably have 50% of the room that says, yay, and 50% of the room that's like, why? Why did we spend, how much did we spend on this? So you have to be prepared for that, because it's going to happen. Even if it's not 50% of the room, then it's 5% of the room, and that 5% will have a lot of power. So, you know, you have to be willing to go out there if you can. Get your cardboard cutouts, get your posters, you know, make it flashy, make it exciting, make it interesting, and then start to have a real conversation about these people and these individual personas and what they can do and how they relate back to the data. Where you came up with them, you talk about that process and you validate them. That has to be a two-way street, because, whether they're pro or con, they're going to have some information for you that might add insight and might allow you to refine them a little bit further. Extrapolation. And this is, there's a handout with some examples of some of these things, so that I would have gone on for hours if I included them all. Extrapolating, the personas can become really the foundation to drive a lot of other movement in the user experience process. You can make a lot of choices about how exactly you want to do that, but the first two are pretty much critical: scenarios and end states / goals. A lot of where people denigrate personas is they say it's not about a goal. It's not, you're talking about jobs, the jobs to be done. People hate personas because they think you're not giving the persona a job. It's completely missing the point. The persona is the beginning of this. You use scenarios, which are basically little narrative stories describing how the persona interacts with the world, and you give them end states and goals. This is goal-directed design. That's the whole point of personas. So yes, of course the persona could have a job to be done. Of course the persona is going to have a goal. There's no other way to develop any kind of metrics of success for a user interface or any other product without having a goal, without having an end state. So those are de facto. Jobs to be done and functional requirements, depending on your process, your methodologies. You might extrapolate out from personas into jobs to be done, into functional requirements. Use cases and user stories, very methodology specific. Development next steps. If you're doing something, an ERP system, you want use cases. If you're doing, an agile development, you want user stories or jobs to be done, starting to replace it. Extension. Okay, this is where personas can start to expand outwards into other components of the agency requirements. Journey maps and touchpoint maps. Up here is more design oriented, down here is more marketing. Service blueprints, and again, I have some examples of these in the handouts. Some of these are probably going to be new to people. Mental models, market maps, and segmentation maps. So here you're starting to really use the persona to discover how users are interacting with your product or your service, all the way down to taking those personas and expanding them out into a market map and a segmentation map, and seeing where they fit into your constellation of other customers, of other users. And this is sort of the crux of the problem personas solve, right? When you're a marketing organization of any kind, which is pretty much every organization, you're selling stuff, you can start to develop some tension with customers. It's like, I want your money and I don't want to give you my money for your stuff. But they're actually, the customers and the companies have the same goals. It's just really easy to forget that. I have a thing you want and you want it. The rest of it is all just how you negotiate that, how you reduce the friction, and how you communicate clearly. And so into focusing your design, you use your personas as guideposts as you design. This is sort of the basic UX, UI stuff, right? IA, user flow, wireframes, prototypes. How will the persona use the design? Marketing and promotional materials. How will the persona respond to the concept? And these are questions that when you have good, solid, data-driven personas, you can ask yourself these questions and have answers. Vicky the VIP is going to respond differently than Dave the dad, to different marketing and different promotion, okay? And involve real users as much as you can. Test and develop feedback loops. Oh, this is a good one. I almost forgot. That's why it's on there. Personas give you permission to say no to off-target design, marketing, or feature requests. there's never been an agency in existence that didn't have customers and clients calling them all the time to say, I want this, I like blue rather than purple, make the type bigger, whatever. Using personas, you can reframe all of those questions through the lens of the persona. You can say, well, okay, let's talk about that. How would Dave the dad react to this design change or this feature creep or this new thing that you want? We need to walk that back, and we need to talk about that change. It can't just be sort of yes, no. And maybe it's an appropriate change. Maybe the phone call was absolutely on target, but this gives you a way to measure all of those changes before just sort of jumping in and doing them. And user goals influence KPIs. So persona scenarios and end states directly translate into user stories and test cases. So if you're doing a sort of full-blown agile or even a waterfall development process, you take those scenarios, and those scenarios actually get expanded out into user stories, and those turn into your test cases. So you have an end-to-end process that involves the persona from the start to the finish. Okay? Goal-directed design driven by personas can generate useful KPIs above and beyond just conversion. You can look at how your individual personas are behaving and interacting with your product, with your website, with your app, and you can design KPIs into their goals. Okay, so it's a little bit different than saying, I want everybody to click the big blue 20% off button. It's more about thinking, okay, Sally wants to do X, Y, Z. How can we measure whether or not we are successful at helping her do X, Y, Z? Okay. Ongoing usability testing should always be developed with the personas in mind. As your product grows and changes, service grows and changes, that should be reincorporated. And marketing personas can become the foundation for segmentation and eventually personalization. Personalization gets very hairy. It's really easy to start with, 5 or 6 personas and wind up with 500 or 600 personas because you want to capture all of the different personalization dimensions. It's not what they're for. The best and it becomes unmanageable really quickly. So you can take a persona and you can add dimensions in terms of segments that are associated with that persona, but the best they're going to do is give you direction about personalization and about segmentation. You can't rely on them 100% for that. And that is it. I'm closing with another quote from Alan, which I'll let you read. But the main thing here is you need to go somewhere, right? The personas are a way to get you from one place to another place.